Good morning. Today's video is going to be a little bit different because I'm with coronavirus dominating the news around the world. I thought it might be a good idea to give some of you guys out there a window on what it's like being in Asia and more specifically Singapore during the pandemic that's currently spreading around the world like crazy. If you've been watching the news, like so many of the rest of us, then you probably noticed that Singapore is quite often held up as a good example of how to deal with the coronavirus. And anybody who's knows what's going on here knows that life up to now, it's March 30th now, it's been pretty normal for most people. There's not been a lot of restrictions on daily life. I mean, people are still going to work and still going out to exercise, and shops are open for the most. Hasn't changed too much, although it has changed a bit over the last few weeks, which I'll go into detail a bit later. I mean, why has the Singaporean government been so effective in containing the virus up to date? I mean, you have to look at the numbers. I think we've got just over 900 total cases now since the outbreak first occurred in China, in Wuhan. But when you look at 900, 950, you think it's a big number, but you have to bear in mind that around more than 200 of those people have already been discharged, and there's another 200 plus that have recovered and are just waiting to get the all clear before they are released back into society. So all over there's about 400 plus people infected at the moment, and Singapore has quite strict regulations with positive people who've been diagnosed as positive. They're either put into an isolation room or an isolation centre for observation, and then obviously if they get worse they go to ICU. If they get better, then they're eventually discharged. So out of those 900 plus cases, only about 400 plus are 400 to 500 maybe are active at the moment, and all those people have been kind of isolated from society in general. So it feels safe here, and the government puts a lot of effort into isolating people and then contact tracing. They formulate a history of each positive test, each person that tests positive, and trace all their contacts, all their known contacts, and if they feel the desire to do so, they put them into quarantine or issue them with a stay-at-home notice, which is very strictly enforced. You get random checks. People come to your house to check that you haven't violated the notice, and you get phone calls throughout the day to check on your whereabouts. And people who break the stay-at-home notices are dealt with pretty severely. I mean, there was an example the other day of a Singaporean guy who had his passport cancelled because he was issued with a stay-at-home notice, and then he decided to go to Batam in Indonesia, which is just over the water, about half an hour away. And then when he came back, they wouldn't take any more and cancelled his passport. So no more travels for him. So they're really efficient and strict in the way they deal with people once they test positive or they are a suspected case. People here largely tend to follow government advice, and so if they're told to stay at home, they'll stay at home. So yeah, they've done a really great job in containing the virus up to date, and now they've even got an app. It's called Trace Together, and it uses Bluetooth on your phone, and it keeps a log of all the other phones that you've been in close contact with over a certain period of time. And then if one of those people happens to be diagnosed as positive, you will get a message telling you that you're potentially at risk, and so then they'll do an assessment, and so that's another way they're using tech to contain the coronavirus, and it kind of makes people feel safe so they can carry on with their daily life. I say carry on with your daily life, but over the last week or so there has been an increase in social distancing measures and enforcement of these measures. So for example, I went to the mall last Friday and they've introduced a system where you can only go in through certain entrances and exits, and you have to stand a certain distance apart when you're lining up for anything. And hawker centres, which are kind of the lifeblood of Singapore, a lot of people eat in them every day, they have enforced spacing in the seating areas so people don't get too close. And there's also new restrictions on the amount of people who can gather in a group. So I have 2 kids and all their after school activities have been called off temporarily now, so there's no football and there's no netball and no taekwondo. So things have changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but that's because there's been a rise in cases, a big jump in the number of cases over the last couple of weeks. But that is solely down to the amount of Singaporeans and residents who've been returning from overseas, Europe and the US, and a lot of them have been infected and they've come back and tested positive. In response to that increase in cases, they've introduced more strict social distancing now, in a bid to make sure it doesn't get out of hand with local transmission. But me personally, that hasn't really had a big effect on me because I've been keeping track on this virus ever since it first came about in China. 1 month, 6 weeks ago, I personally started social distancing, although that's not difficult for me because I've been working at home for the last 4 years, so I'm very apt at social distancing, so you could say. So like I go out, and when I'm waiting at the bus stop, I will stand away from other people. And when I go on public transport, we wear face masks, which is quite alien to a lot of Westerners, but when you live in Asia, it's quite a common thing to do. I mean, before I lived in Singapore, I lived in Taiwan for almost 18 years. My wife is from Taiwan. And I'm kind of one of the foreigners who will, when in Rome, that's my kind of edict for life. So when I was in Taiwan, I kind of immersed myself in the local culture, local food, very comfortable in the Asian way of life. You know, in Asia, when people have a cold, especially in Taiwan, when people have a cold or a cough and they go to work, they will generally wear a mask to avoid spreading it, because in the big cities of Asia, there's a lot of people all crammed into small spaces, and your personal space is violated quite often. And if you're not used to that, it's kind of makes you feel uncomfortable. But the longer you spend in a place like Taiwan or Singapore, you get used to it. So we would wear masks when we went to work to avoid spreading it around. And so wearing a mask for me now, when I go outside, not when I go outside, but when I go on public transport, it's just second nature, and it gives you an extra layer of security. Another thing I've been doing is I've been exercising. I exercise daily, but I've been kind of avoiding busy places recently and exercising at less peak hours, because early in the morning and about tea time in Singapore, 5 to 7 o'clock, it's very busy if you want to go out to exercise. So I've kind of been avoiding those hours to limit the amount of contact I have with strangers. Yeah. So I've kind of enforced my social distancing way before the government started to. Yeah. So the one weird thing about Singapore as opposed to a lot of other places around the world, is that the kids are still at school here, which kind of feels a bit weird because my wife and I are working from home, and yet the kids are still going to school every day. So it kind of makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, but generally things are very well organised here, and the government advice is pretty good, so you feel safe, but there's kind of like a nag in the back of your mind about sending the kids outside every day. But yeah, that's actually changing as recently. In fact, this week the kids will start actually spending 1 day per week home, learning at home. And I guess if the cases become more widespread, then that will increase, or maybe they will just homeschool 5 days a week. I don't know. That's just that's to be decided in the future. Talking about masks, I've seen a lot of people on Facebook and Twitter sharing a chart recently. I'll put it on screen. Highlighting that the countries or regions with the flattest curves, we all know that phrase by now, to flatten the curve to ensure the virus doesn't spread so quickly through the population. They're saying that, oh yeah, masks, look at the masks, look at the effect masks have, because they've highlighted that Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea have had flatter curves because they wear masks. But that is not strictly true, because in Singapore, from my experience, I would suggest that only around 20% of people are wearing masks when they're out and about. I think wearing masks is definitely one factor in containing the spread, but from Singapore's example, you can see that it's not the only factor. I mean, if you look at the measures that countries like South Korea, Singapore and Hong Kong have taken, then you'll see that it's not just masks. They have these strict quarantine rules, and you can get in trouble if you break them. They are stopping people at airports and testing them for fevers. They've been doing that for ever since the pandemic began, or even before the pandemic began. They've been screening passengers as they enter the country. Anybody with a fever goes straight into quarantine. Nowadays, everybody's gone into quarantine, which I believe is not the case in other countries. Even in the UK, I read the other day that people are still flying in from New York, which is a hotspot at the moment, and just walking through customs and immigration with no checks or anything like that. That's not the case in the places I mentioned. They're strictly screened, quarantined if found to be positive, and contact tracing. They have put a lot of resources into stopping the spread, and that is why the curves are flatter from these places, and why, as far as I know, they haven't had to implement a lockdown so far. So when people share these charts and these conclusions they've come up with, it's not always the case, so be careful. Yeah, speaking about masks, I mean, the Singaporean government very early on advised people not to wear masks. I mean, they did this, I believe, because they didn't want millions of people panic buying masks and leaving them short for the people who really need them, the healthcare workers. Yeah, so since then, there hasn't been mass wearing of masks in Singapore. I personally wear a mask, I'm not afraid to say it, but only when I go on public transport, such as the subway and the bus, because we don't have a car in Singapore. And I've found that when you go on public transport, you get people coughing and sneezing on the bus or on the MRT, and they're not wearing a mask. So if they're not going to do that, then to protect myself and my family, we're going to wear masks. And I have no qualms about doing that. So we have a rule in our family right now that if you go on the bus or the MRT, you wear a mask. And that's working well for us so far. But yeah, I mean, the biggest problem recently has been the people returning from Europe and the US. Large numbers of them have been testing positive. I'm ashamed to say we're returning from the UK, which kind of says something about the situation of the virus in the UK. I think it's pretty rife there, which for me as a British national is kind of upsetting, because my parents and my family are in the UK, and my parents are old, they're in their 70s, and yeah, it's kind of concerning for me that they're in a country where the virus, should I say, seems to be out of control for now. I'm granted they've done a lockdown in the last week or so, but up until that point, it was very worrying for me, and I'll tell you, I was actually in tears after speaking to my mom a couple of weeks ago, because I felt so helpless over here. I couldn't do anything for her, apart from what I'd been doing beforehand, which was calling her and telling her, this is serious, you need to stay inside, don't mix with people. And luckily, my parents, they're both pretty sensible, and they followed the advice pretty strictly, and so they're okay up to now. And also, thankfully, my brother still lives close by, back in the UK, so he's able to deliver food for them and just check on their general well-being. And I've increased the amount of times I've been calling my parents the last couple of weeks, every few days, just to check on their well-being. And it kind of cheers me up to say that my mom and my dad seem to be coping pretty well with being locked in pretty much 24/7. So yeah, although it's still worrying, it's kind of a little bit comforting at the same time to know that they're doing so well so far. And just coronavirus in general, I mean, it's an unprecedented. I know everybody's fed up with people using that word, but the situation is like nothing we've ever experienced before. And looking at the news, I mean, I've worked in the media for almost 15 years now, and so I'm used to looking at the news a lot every day. And just recently, the news has become, there's no other better way to say it than depressing. So I've actually started limiting the amount of time I spend looking at the news online while I'm at home. So now I'm trying to keep it down to like an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, just for your general well-being, because it can get depressing reading all the bad news, the death tolls and the spread and the economic ramifications of the crisis. So yeah, that's my bit of advice to you from this video. Try not to read the news too much, and focus on the positive rather than the negative. Yeah, so that's all I've got to say for my first coronavirus video. Just let me know if you enjoyed it, and I'll maybe do an update in a week or so, or a few days, depending on what happens. And just be positive. We can get through this if everybody follows the advice of experts. And yeah, hope to see you again for the next video. Take it easy.